Hello students, welcome to this e-learning. In this video, we will be discussing a poem, Mending Wall by Robert Frost. Robert Lee Frost was an American poet. His work was initially published in England before it was published in America. Born on 26 March 1874, San Francisco, California, United States, and died on 29 January 1963, Boston, Massachusetts, United States. Robert Frost was much admired for his depictions of the rural life of New England. His command of American colloquial speech and his realistic verse portraying ordinary people in everyday situations. He was a bright child of William Prescott Frost, a renowned journalist, while his mother, Isabel Moody, was a Scottish immigrant. His father worked as a teacher for many years. Robert's father was also an unsuccessful candidate for a city tax collector. Sadly, his father died due to tuberculosis in 1885 when Frost was just 11 years old. After his father's demise, the family moved to eastern Massachusetts to stay with their grandparents. Robert Lee Frost attended Lawrence High School and graduated in 1892 as a valedictorian poet. It was there he learned character types, distinctive speech patterns, and regional costumes. He attended Dartmouth College. Later in 1897, he attended Harvard University, but unfortunately, he was dropped out twice due to his fragile health. Later, he received his Master of Arts in 1918 and his doctoral degrees from Oxford and Cambridge in 1957. Throughout his educational career, he remained a brilliant student. He used to share his ideas with Eleanor White and later fell in love with her. He started his writing career at high school, while his first professional publication, My Butterfly, an elegy, appeared in The Independent, a weekly literary journal. Robert Lee Frost married Eleanor White. To raise his family, he tried his hands on chicken farming at Methuen, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, that business also met failure. Another calamity hit when his children died. Despite failures, loss, and frustrations in business and life, Robert never gave up and pursued his interest in poetry resolutely. He is often quoted poet. Frost received 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry in his lifetime. Frost always wrote his own style, never imitating the current trends. He was never known as an experimental poet, but rather used traditional techniques to describe the world as he saw it, often in simple detail. His popular works include After Apple Picking, Mending Wall, Breeches, Out Out, Fire and Ice, Nothing Gold Can Stay, Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, A Way Out, a one-act play, A Mask of Reason, A Mask of Mercy, The Notebooks of Robert Frost, edited by Robert Fagan, Selected Letters of Robert Frost. Okay, these are his works which were popular. Now let's move on to the poem. Mending Wall is a poem by the American poet Robert Frost. It was published in 1914 as the first entry in Frost's second book of poems, North of Boston. It is a blank verse that remains relevant for these uncertain times. It involves two rural neighbors who one spring day meet to walk along the wall that separate their properties and repair it where needed. The speaker in the poem is a progressive individual who starts to question the need for such a wall in the first place. The neighbor beyond the hill is a traditionalist and has, it seems, little time for such nonsense. Good fences make good neighbors, is all he will say. Throughout the poem, the wall functions as a metaphor, indicating the necessity of simultaneous connecting and separation between human beings. Although individuals long to connect with one another, a connection that is too close or boundaries that are indistinctive can be dangerous. Yet, disruption of these boundaries is probably inevitable, since the frozen ground swell that damages the wall, though it occurs annually, is never observed. The neighbors can only maintain their relationship through conscious attention to the wall that separates them. Now let us discuss the poem line-wise. Mending Wall. The poem is in first-person narrative and cast in a continuous fashion rather than being divided into stanzas to enhance the informal conversational tone. Here the poem is not divided into stanzas, but it is in a continuous form, so we will be discussing it line-wise. The poem is set at the site of the stone wall between the farms of two hard-working men of New England, one of whom is the poet himself. There is speculation on how the said wall has come to be broken. There is the talk of rebuilding the wall as well. The first line, something there is that doesn't love a wall. The poem starts with an observation that there is something in the nature that doesn't like walls. In the poem Mending Wall, nature acts as a third character alongside the speaker and his neighbor, even though this has been explicitly mentioned by differentiating something from someone. He makes his stand that those are not humans but things which are keeping him from building the walls. Here, wall represents a kind of barrier, mental and physical, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun. Here, in this line, it presents a powerful image of something, the cold ground under the wall, to swell and burst. The ground bursts in a way that the boulders come splitting out from within to the outside. It merely explains the view of the speaker that something wanted to keep the wall from being constructed, so it crumbles from the nature or the natural action and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The speaker further says, the crumbling of the wall due to the natural activity makes gaps where the two neighbors can pass through easily. Here I have given some few annotations and word meaning. Like frozen ground swell, it is referring to the uplift of soil or other surface deposits due to expansion of underground water on freezing. The ground swells because of the underground water. Spills, to empty out or be emptied out onto a surface. It shows the presence of third person. Okay, third person spills. Boulders, large rock, typically one that has been worn smooth by erosion. Abreast, side by side and facing the same. 5 to 9. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair, where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The speaker points out that the work of the hunters are another obstacle to the wall between the two neighbors. They cause damage to the wall during their sport and don't make repair to those damages. The speaker has to make regular repairs, as he points it in, I have come after them. It may be because the wall restricts the otherwise widespread or wider spread of the hunting ground. The speaker continues to point out the trouble the hunting causes. They don't even hesitate to tear down the walls to find the rabbits from the hiding to please their barking, yelping dogs. Yelping, to utter a short, sharp cry, especially of pain or alarm. Hiding, the action of concealing someone or something. Let's move on. Lines 9 to 14. The gaps I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made. But at spring mending time, we find them there. I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. Despite various contributing causes for the wall being torn down, the fact remains that nobody knows or hears about how or when the gaps are formed, but the speaker certainly discovers the gap at the spring mending time. The speaker finally mentions his neighbor. He says he let his neighbor across the dividing line know about the damages so they can repair them together. And on that day, they meet to go with the whole mending business as they do it every year. The word mending, it is the present participle of the word mend, and it means repair. Next, lines 15 to 19. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each, and some are loaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. The narrator clarifies that they keep the wall in between when they do the mending job. The speaker and the neighbor notice the boulder which have fallen to either side. They find that some of these boulders look like loaves of bread, some are round as ball. They anticipate the difficulty in putting them to use and believe that it would need a spell to balance them together so that the boulders stand on one another. It seems no matter what they do, the boulders fail to stick and fall down. So out of despair, the neighbors yell at the stones to stay put or stay still until they turn their back. They want to confirm that the wall stands intact, at least in their presence. This is to indicate how difficult it was to mend the wall on a regular basis. Loaves, the plural form of the word loaf, that is something having an oblong shape. Balls, here in the poem, referring to an object in round shape, which is round in shape. Spell, a form of words used as a magical charm. And the line, stay where you are until our backs are turned, says stay still, okay, till we turn back. Moving on, line 20 to 27, we wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There, where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine, and I am apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines. I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. The figures of the neighbors are rough. The fingers, okay? The fingers of the neighbors are rough and callous with the handling of boulders over and over again. They find the task just like another outdoor game with the wall line demarcating the two opponents playing from across the line. This is the first time in the poem Mending Wall that the poet bring out the differences in opinion the speaker has with his neighbor to the fore. The speaker says, as opposed to his neighbors, the presence of the wall is plainly unnecessary. He is totally skeptical of the wall, especially when there is no movable property under threat of moving into each other's land. He mentions that they have two different kinds of orchards. The speaker also mentioned that his apple tree would never ever cross to his neighbor's yard to cause damage to his pine trees. Similarly, his neighbor's pines are not going to come and disturb his lot. Hence, putting up a wall is a futile exercise. The neighbor doesn't pay heed to the arguments the speaker puts. He only mentions good fences make good neighbors. The phrase good fences make good neighbors has been around for centuries in different words and formations, but it was Frost who framed the popular phrase to reiterate the old wisdom. Okay? Now here some word meanings are wear, damage, erode or destroy by friction or use. Orchard, a piece of enclosed land planted with fruit trees. Cones, the dry fruit of a conifer, typically tapering to a rounded end and formed of a tight array of overlapping scales on a central axis, which separates to release the seeds. Moving on, we have lines 28 to 34. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head, why do they make a good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows? But here there are no cows. Before I build a wall, I would ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Here, when the poet says, when spring arrives, the speaker becomes a bit mischievous in his attempts to convince his neighbor to rethink his decision of putting up the wall and mending it when the gaps are visible. In these lines, okay, you will find that the speaker tries to convince his neighbor the other way and nearly accuses him of being a believer of antiquated old traditions. Continuing with the same pace and tone, the narrator asks why the walls can make good neighbors. He seeks his neighbor's reasoning for putting up the wall a purpose. He argues that walls are needed to be kept from the neighbor's premises, but since here there are no cows and only trees, there is no need for a wall in between. The neighbor continues his stand and says every time he builds the wall, he would ask to know what was he walling in or walling out. He always asks what was being separated and what was being brought together with the wall that they were constructing. And he also asks whether this wall would offend anyone. Mischief is playful behavior, notion, a general understanding, vague or imperfect conception or idea of something. Offense or annoyance, annoyance or resentment brought about by a perceived insult to or disregard for oneself. Line 35 to 40. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down, I could say elves to him. But it's not elves exactly, and I would rather he said it for himself. I see him there, bringing a stone, grasped firmly by the top, in each hand like an old stone savage armed. The poet once again points out that there is something that doesn't love a wall and wants it to go down. He evokes a sense of mystery in the minds of the people about this something. The readers, those who are reading the poem, he wants to evoke it. The speaker is desperate to find the ways to convince his neighbors otherwise. He says that he could point towards elves as the reason for bringing down the wall, but he knows it is not really the elves. So he suggests that the neighbor should come up with a reason for the same on his own. Here the poet makes an allusion to elves. The elves are tiny, mythical, supernatural beings from folklore. Despite all his efforts and hopes and dreams of turning the neighbor around, the speaker sees that the neighbor is bringing stone grasped firmly by the top in each of his hands. He looked like an armed old stone savage, totally unaffected by the speaker's intentions and desire. With the use of like, the poet uses simile. Simile is a poetic device which we will be discussing once this explanation is over. So he uses this simile to compare the appearance of the neighbor with an armed stone-edged savage. This is also symbolic in suggesting that the neighbor's thoughts and ideas are archaic, very traditional. Elves, as I said, it is a supernatural creature of folk tales, especially typically represented as a small, delicate, elusive figure in human form with pointed ears, magical powers, and capricious nature. Grasped, to seize and hold firmly. Savage, a member of people regarded as primitive and uncivilized. Armed, equipped with or carrying a firearm or firearms. Moving on, he moves in darkness as it seems to me, not of woods only and the shades of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well. He again says, good fences makes good neighbors. Here, the speaker now firmly believes that the neighbor is living in darkness, not just the darkness due to words and tree shades. The speaker feels that the neighbor is under the tight grip of darkness of ignorance. The speaker says that his neighbor is unwilling to compromise his hereditary wealth. He is unwilling to go beyond something his father used to say. He probably likes how well he can remember it. The neighbor stands his ground and utters once again, "Good fences makes good neighbors." The annotation here, "moves in darkness," it is referring to the neighbor's traditional beliefs and methods which he doesn't want to change for reason best known to him. Okay, so here this is the end of the explanation. Next, let us discuss the literary devices used in the poem. The first is apostrophe. Okay, this is a device that is used when a speaker breaks off from addressing one party and instead addresses a third party. The third party may be an individual, either present or absent in the scene. It can also be an inanimate object, such as in line 19, he asks the boulders to stay balanced. It says, "Stay where you are until our backs are turned." Enjambment. Enjambment refers to the continuous or a continuation of a sentence without a pause beyond the end of a line. Couplet or stanza, such as, "And he likes having thought of it so well," he says again, "Good fences make good neighbors." So the line does not end here, but it continues in the next line also. So this is enjambment. Metaphor. It is a figure of speech that describes an object or action in a way that isn't literally true, but helps explain an idea or make a comparison. Such as, "And some are loaves and some so nearly balls. We have to use a spell to make them balance." Next, imagery. Imagery is used to make the readers perceive things with their five senses. Like, "Some are loaves and some are so nearly balls. He is all pine and I am orchard, an apple orchard." Personification. Giving a human quality or characteristic to something which is not human. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it. In the above lines, an unseen force in nature has been personified. Okay, so it has been given the human quality, which is unseen force in nature. Next, parallelism. Parallelism is a figure of speech that has a similar word order and structure in their syntax, like, "To each the boulders that have fallen to each." Here, to each, to each, to each, isn't it? So to each is parallelism, as it emphasizes the fact that the narrator and his neighbors are on the opposite sides of the wall. Paradox. A statement or proposition that seems self-contradictory or absurd, but in reality expresses a possible truth, such as, "Good fences make good neighbors." Alliteration. The repetition of usually initial consonant sound in two or more neighboring words or syllables, such as, "We wear our fingers with handling them. Before I build a wall, what I was walling in or walling out." So this is the repetition of the usually initial consonant sound, "we wear," isn't it? "We wear with." Okay, what was walling. So these are the initial consonant sound in two or more neighboring words or syllables. Okay, moving on, we will discuss the themes of the poem. The themes that we are going to discuss in the poem. First is boundaries and walls. Okay, the boundaries and the walls. Next, the value of work. Next, savagery and darkness. Next, change and modernity. So we will discuss this one after the other. First, let us discuss boundaries and wall. So here, borders, boundaries or borders, isn't it? At its heart, Mending Wall is a poem about borders or boundaries, the work it takes to maintain them, and the way they shape human interactions. The speaker and the speaker's neighbor spend much of the poem, or much of the time in the poem, rebuilding a wall that divides their properties. As they do so, they debate the function of the wall and how it affects their relationship. The speaker suggests that the wall is unnecessary both practically and politically. In the speaker's mind, wall excludes people enduring otherwise harmonious relationship. But the neighbor argues that walls actually improve relationship because they allow people to treat each other fairly and prevent conflict. The poem the poem doesn't fall too heavily on either side of the debate, ultimately allowing us to decide for ourselves which version or which vision of human community is most convincing. The speaker believes the wall isn't necessary, given the crops that the speaker and the neighbor grow, while cattle might wander over to gaze in someone else's pasture. The speaker's apple aren't going to eat the neighbor's pine tree. More importantly, the speaker believes that walls actively damage people's relationship. This is because walls are likely to give offense. That is, to offend people with their implication of mistrust and exclusion. The speaker thus asks the neighbor why they need to continue repairing the wall at all. In response, the neighbor says simply and repeatedly, good fences make good neighbors. He believes that a good neighbor establishes clear boundary and in doing so prevents problems from arising between people who live near each other. The neighbor seems haunted by the possibility of future conflicts. In fact, he seemed to regard such conflicts as an inevitable part of life, and as such, that is important to take steps to prevent them. For the speaker, there is no reason to engage in such preventive measures because there are no conflicts between him and his neighbor, not even the seeds of future conflict. In this worldview, people are basically decent. It is building the wall itself that seems to the speaker most likely to cause conflict by creating a sense of us versus them and implying that the neighbor doesn't trust each other. Though the speaker gets the most airtime in the poem, it is not entirely clear that the reader or that we, the reader, is supposed to take the speaker's side. Instead, the poem itself remains decidedly ambiguous. It is so unclear to us that the speaker complains for the wall all the time, but it is also the speaker who sets out to mend the wall, in motion by reaching out to the neighbor. And so the poem even gives the neighbor the final word. The poet thus asks its readers to decide for themselves who is right and who is wrong, and to make up their mind about the utility of walls, borders, and other political and physical devices that divide people. The next theme is the value of work. As the speaker describes it, the work of mending wall is ritualistic. Each year, the speaker and the neighbor walk along the wall together and repair the section that has been damaged by frost or by hunters over the previous year. It is a hard and taxing work by their hand. Their hands are chapped from it. The difficulty of the work and the need to renew it every year makes the speaker question why and whether it is necessary to keep rebuilding the wall. More broadly, the act of repairing the wall serves as an allegory for human labor. Though the speaker and the neighbor continue to rebuild the wall, the poem calls into question the value of labor for labor's sake and asks whether a different relationship to work might be possible. Given that their task is repetitive and fruitless, the speaker suggests that they might be better off if they stop repairing the wall altogether. But the poet insists that they keep doing it, and he may suggest that the work itself is good and valuable. It may not simply be fence that makes good neighbors, but the act of rebuilding it, of working together for a common goal. For the speaker, work is justified only by its results, or in this case, physical products, the materials and permanent differences it makes in the world. For the neighbor, however, work is justified as an end in itself, and that work is part of maintaining a fair and livable society. Savagery and darkness, the next theme. The poet says that his neighbor appears to be savage from the Stone Age, using the stones of the wall as weapons, and also that he has a kinship relationship with darkness. Both savagery and darkness are meant to symbolize the narrow-mindedness of his neighbor. In the Stone Age, man was still uncivilized, the world had not yet come under his control, and he felt that he had to jealously guard his few possessions from any creature that came his way or any force of nature that he is unaware of. That is why the Stone Age men fashioned weapons out of stone and used them in constant combat with anything he might be confronted with. These neighbors also jealously guards his land and tries to keep out frost from his property by building the stone wall, and Frost thinks that it is most unjust of him. The poet also says that the darkness he notices in his neighbor is not the darkness of the shade of trees, rather it is the darkness of the heart. He is not open-minded and generous like the poet. He does not believe that all men should interact with each other. He is determined to wall himself in and wall everyone else out. Change and modernity. As the speaker of Mending Wall, the neighbor debate the political and practical purpose of the wall they are repairing. The poem raises an implicit question about the possibility of change. The speaker argues that the neighbors believe that fences are necessary to keep people from getting out of control is out of date. The speaker compares him to an old stone savage, but though his attitude may be antiquated, the neighbor remains influential in the present, articulating a deep-held belief that it is necessary for society to restrain people in small ways to keep them from acting out in big ways. The poem thus asks us to ponder whether the debate between the speaker and his neighbor will ever be resolved, and more broadly whether it is possible for society itself to change. Despite often using everyday simple language, the speaker is clearly an educated talkative figure. By contrast, the neighbor is stern, old-fashioned. He only says one thing in the poem, and he then says it again. His speech is direct and unpretentious. The speaker emphasized this side of the neighbor's character, his willingness to think broadly and deeply. The neighbor is not unwillingness to think broadly or deeply or to interrogate his own ideas. Instead of thinking things through for himself, the neighbor depends on his father's saying, that is, he relies on receiving or received wisdom from his father. As a result, the neighbor seems to the speaker to be like an old stone savage armed. His work is his work in rebuilding the wall resembles primitive forms of violence. He has not advanced beyond the primitive states, but rather preserves its violence in his insistence on constructing barriers between people. The poem thus suggests that as long as people hold ideas like neighbors, society itself will be captivated by them. Unable to refuse the projects they inspire, it is hard to shake off the beliefs of the past and to implement change for the future. So this is all for this video. I hope you have understood the poem thoroughly. If you have not, I suggest you to go through the video again and again, understand it. Obviously, it is a lengthy poem, so you divide the time accordingly and watch section wise. That would be more convenient for you. So, wish you a very fruitful, at the same time a learning time watching this video. Thank you.